Hi students, welcome to the Lesson 6 lecture on Progressivism. I apologize for the background being looking a little bit bare. My wife and I have been doing renovation on our house the past couple of weeks and it's been really hectic. So things look a little odd back there with the walls. We're taking off the wallpaper, repainting, doing a bunch of stuff, probably redoing the floor. So that's been going on, but welcome to Lesson 6 on the Progressive Era, and I call this lecture Progressivism as Populism with a Middle Class Twist, because there's a lot of overlap between the Progressive Era and the populist movement before it, but there are some divergences. And I think what makes the Progressive movement or the Progressive Era unique is how much of a bigger role middle class reformers start to take in the progressive era as opposed to the populist movement of the 1890s. So first we're going to start with the similarities. Although the Populist Party had only limited success at getting their own representatives elected into office, the growing popularity of the populists pressured both of the other main parties to compromise with them. The Democrats were the first to work together with the populists. In the 1896 election, they both rallied behind William Jennings Bryan, unsuccessfully. Then, when the Republican President William McKinley was assassinated by an anarchist in 1901, Vice President Theodore Roosevelt stepped up to the presidency and sharply diverted course from McKinley's conservative free market philosophy. Perhaps the assassination of the former president at the hands of an anarchist was a warning sign that something needed to change unless Theodore Roosevelt wanted to suffer a similar fate. Who knows? In any case, Teddy Roosevelt plunged into a vocal crusade for reform, using the office of the presidency as a bully pulpit, or what he meant was a position from which to set the agenda of conversation and legislative attention in the country to an unprecedented extent. He used this office more than any other before him to really rally the country in favor of various reforms. Because obviously, Congress is the branch that technically passes laws, writes laws, and passes laws. And of course, nowadays we're used to the president influencing that process a lot by being very visible in the media. That was really pioneered to a large extent by Theodore Roosevelt. This guy right here. So Roosevelt believed that the federal government's job was to regulate capitalism and punish bad behavior to preserve stability and order in society. So, like the populists, Roosevelt tried to find a middle ground of compromise between the unregulated free market capitalism of the Gilded Age and, on the other hand, the anarchist or socialist revolution that some Americans proposed as an antidote for the inequality that had been generated by the unregulated free market capitalism of the previous era. So Roosevelt tried to find a middle ground. Roosevelt saw the president as a mediator between all interest groups, farmers, consumers, labor, and big business. Roosevelt's philosophy was to encourage compromise between economic classes in the country for the sake of national stability, harmony, prosperity, and strength. For example, the United Mine Workers went on strike in Pennsylvania and struck for higher pay, shorter hours, and recognition of their union. The mine owners at first refused to meet with the union, and the prolonged strike created coal shortages across the U.S. in the winter. Roosevelt invited both parties to negotiate in Washington, but the mining companies refused at first. Roosevelt then threatened to send in the army to operate the coal mines. This got the mine owners to negotiate, and the miners got better wages and hours, although Roosevelt also pressured the miners not to be too demanding with their requests. During his 7 years in office, from 1901 to 1908, Roosevelt helped push through all of the following reforms to regulate the economy along very similar lines to what had been proposed by the Populist Party in the decade before. So trust busting, breaking up monopolies. Roosevelt's administration was the first to successfully use the Sherman Antitrust Act for what it was intended. For example, a lawsuit against Northern Securities was upheld by the Supreme Court, and in total 43 trusts were broken up during Roosevelt's time in office, including Standard Oil, DuPont, and American Tobacco Company. The Elkins Act and Hepburn Railway Act were passed to regulate railroad shipping rates through the Interstate Commerce Commission. The regulation of businesses was expanded with the Meat Inspection Act and the Pure Food and Drug Act, especially businesses that produced food for consumers. And in conservation, Roosevelt advocated the public ownership of wilderness and the scientific management of resources. He increased funding for national parks, provided funding for dam and canal projects, and increased the size and scope of the Department of the Interior. Roosevelt desired to retire from public life and go on a safari in Africa, and he was confident that he had found the right hand-picked man to carry his agenda forward, William Howard Taft. So Roosevelt got behind Taft and promoted Taft as the Republican that everyone should vote for in the 1908 election, which people did. However, Taft was a lawyer with no political experience and no enthusiasm for the job of president. Taft once complained that the job of being president was the loneliest job in the world. And lacking Roosevelt's confidence, Taft tended to be more cautious, more easily manipulated, and more pro-big business. Nevertheless, the populist-flavored achievements of his administration should be recognized, such as continuation of trust busting, expanding national forest reserves, an 8-hour day standard for federal workers, and various pieces of mine and railroad safety legislation. That said, Theodore Roosevelt felt that William Howard Taft had let him down. Coming back from his safari in Africa, Theodore Roosevelt decided that he would run for president again. However, Taft had by now acquired powerful backers in the Republican Party, so Theodore Roosevelt was forced to start a new third party, the Progressive Party, or what came to be known as the Bull Moose Party, after Roosevelt boasted of feeling as strong as a bull moose. Republican voters felt split between Taft and Roosevelt. And then Woodrow Wilson, the Democrat, also courted some of the populist vote, promising to, among other things, lower the tariff. And then there was Eugene V. Debs, the socialist candidate, who had even more ambitious plans for reform. So voters had 4 different shades of populist/progressive reform to pick from in the 1912 election, with Woodrow Wilson arguably having the least ambitious plans for reform, followed by Taft, followed by Roosevelt, followed by Debs as the most radical. The more radical voters tended to split themselves 3 ways between Taft, Roosevelt, and Debs, giving Woodrow Wilson the victory, with about 42% of the popular vote, as opposed to about 27% for Roosevelt, 23% for Taft, and about 6% for Eugene Debs with the Socialist Party. And if you're curious for more information on these individuals, there's a YouTube documentary on these progressive era presidents and a transcript here. Woodrow Wilson helped accomplish a lot of reforms that the populists have been calling for all along since the 1890s. For example, Congress passed the 16th Amendment permitting the income tax, and the 17th Amendment that initiated the direct election of senators instead of senators being appointed by state legislatures. Many states legislated to make government more democratic with direct primaries, the initiative, the referendum, and the ability to recall public officials before their term was up. After World War I, Congress would also pass the 19th Amendment to grant women across the country the right to vote. Then there was tariff reform. The so-called Underwood Tariff significantly lowered taxes on imported goods. And then the graduated income tax that they just implemented, thanks to the 16th Amendment, compensated for the missing revenues for the federal government. Then regulation of corporations. The Federal Trade Commission was created, and the Clayton Antitrust Act was passed in 1914 to increase the government's trust-busting powers. Wilson initially opposed labor reform and farm aid, but the reunited Republican Party challenged the Democrats in the 1916 election, and Wilson realized that the only way to win again was for the Democrats to fully embrace the populist slash progressive vision. So after 1916, Democrats in Congress were then able to pass the following labor and farm reforms, such as the Farm Loan Act, which gave low-interest loans to farmers, the Keating-Owen Act to ban child labor in interstate industry, the Adamson Act to mandate an 8-hour day for railroad workers, the Seamen's Act to protect sailors from abuses, and the Workers' Compensation Act for federal workers. Compared to how these sorts of reforms have been stonewalled when it had been the populists advocating for them in the 1890s, this flurry of change in the early 1900s was truly remarkable, in my opinion. Part of why these reforms suddenly gained so much momentum was the urban middle class's increased awareness of the problems experienced by farmers, workers, and the poor thanks to the muckrakers. So who are the muckrakers? They were basically investigative journalists who exposed corruption, mistreatment, and scandals in many areas of economy and politics. They also included photographers who recorded shocking living and working conditions. The articles eventually were expanded into books. Influential muckrakers included Ida Tarbell, who published History of the Standard Oil Company, showed how John D. Rockefeller made it into a monopoly. Lincoln Steffens, The Shame of the Cities, showed urban corruption. Jacob Riis, How the Other Half Lives, photographed and described the worst slums of New York City. And then Upton Sinclair wrote his novel The Jungle to describe the suffering of immigrants in unsafe meatpacking plants and to advocate socialism as an antidote to what he saw as the cutthroat law of the jungle-like nature of capitalist society. But it was his descriptions of how a lot of the meat was packaged uncleanly and how it was dangerous for consumers. That's what really alarmed middle-class readers across the nation, and that's what quickly motivated the passage of the Meat Inspection Act. So the middle-class readers paid much more attention to that part of the book than the plight of the immigrant workers in these unsafe working conditions. And the reaction of progressives to Upton Sinclair's book, The Jungle, brings me to mention one of the biggest divergences between progressivism and the populist movement before it. And this biggest divergence, I think, was the class of people who were involved with shaping the proposed reforms into their final forms. So, for example, the populist movement was made up mostly of farmers and some trade union workers. There were very few middle-class professionals in the populist movement. This changed in the progressive movement. Suddenly, middle-class professionals became very concerned about the plight of poor farmers and workers for a number of possible reasons. Perhaps partly out of fear that these uneducated ruffians would demand truly extreme changes if something were not done for them soon. And the assassinations by anarchists at the time seem to attest to that, perhaps. Perhaps partly out of guilt that some other people had it much worse. Perhaps partly out of a feeling that the miseries of the urban poor were causing more uncomfortable and distasteful urban social problems to develop, such as crime, homelessness, prostitution, mental illness, drug addiction, problems that were, ruining the middle class's enjoyment of their urban environment and their feeling of safety in that environment. And remember, this was before the widespread adoption of the automobile and the creation of suburbs. So middle-class professionals had to live more shoulder to shoulder with the lower class and their problems. Some of this reform-mindedness might have been motivated partly out of genuine intrinsic concern for their fellow human beings. It's probably a combination of all of these. But one consequence of the progressive movement being led more by middle-class professionals was that progressivism more strongly emphasized compromise between classes rather than unashamed struggle by one class against another. So compare that with, for example, the goal of some poor farmers to enact sweet revenge on the big banks that were foreclosing on their homes, or the dream of poor workers enacting sweet revenge on their money bags, robber baron bosses, as they're sometimes referred to. So that's one difference. Another difference was the progressive movement tended to try to depoliticize problems and hand them over to supposedly impartial middle class experts to solve in whatever way those experts saw fit. And finally, the progressive movement uh, extended the populist zeal for government regulation of businesses to government regulation of moral and cultural slash behavioral issues as well, which the populace never asked for. The populace never asked for really the prohibition of alcohol, although some people like Mary Elizabeth Lease did, but it wasn't the focal point of populism, nor was the idea of regulating opiate medications, as was accomplished with the Harrison Narcotics Tax Act in the Progressive era in 1914. And many states also put bans on brothels and prostitution, and just generally many more behavioral regulations started to be passed in the Progressive era. And these were things that the populace had never really asked for. All the populace wanted to do was regulate big business. So you started getting kind of this, very like morally, arguably kind of domineering attitude from these progressive reformers that, we know better than you what you should be doing. Um, so one way in which progressivism is different than populism is progressivism thought of itself as ruled by the experts. We're going to put the experts in charge. And one reason for why this idea caught on was after the Civil War, many occupations became professionalized with a prescribed course of study, examinations, degrees, licenses, professional organizations, journals, research fellowships, conferences, and so on. The new professions included medicine and law, architecture, engineering, economics, and others. Progressives believed that they could use the results of this research uh, to modify and improve human behavior. They wanted to apply the principles of science, rationality, and efficiency to social, economic, and political reform. Social problems could be solved, they thought, by first investigating the social evil, gathering the facts, then publishing them to inform and educate the public, to win support for reform, and finally finding and enforcing a solution. They had an optimistic belief in the ability of humans to improve and progress as a result, but only if people followed the advice of the experts. On the other hand, if politicians obeyed the wishes of the unwashed, ignorant masses, as they were sometimes referred to, poor common people, then many progressives feared that ruin would come to the country. A prime example of this trust in experts over popular opinion was the Federal Reserve Act. This brought reform to the monetary system as the populace wanted, but not in the way that the populace had wanted. Instead of listening to the complaints of poor, indebted farmers and increasing the money supply by allowing silver as well as gold to back the creation of additional paper notes, the Federal Reserve Act kept the gold standard strictly intact, but merely placed its operation under the supervision of a privately funded but publicly regulated national banking system, the so-called Federal Reserve Bank, with its 12 regional branches. So, although technically the President and Congress were in charge of appointing Federal Reserve Board members, these board members in practice cooperated very closely with the most powerful bankers of the country, like J.P. Morgan. So to populists, this progressive solution to the monetary system seemed like putting the fox in charge of the henhouse. According to the populists, the Federal Reserve Act did little to make the banking system accountable to popular opinion. If anything, it did the opposite by walling off monetary policy as an area of public policy to be influenced only by appointed expert opinion from that point onwards. Progressives also influenced the educational system. Progressives pushed for more standardized testing and curriculum in order to bring a more supposedly scientific approach to teaching. Two other professions were especially important for progressivism: public health and social work. When it came to public health, many progressives sometimes embraced concepts of social Darwinism, unlike the populists. Some progressives tried to give scientific justification to the idea that the Anglo-Saxon race was superior. One offshoot of this was the eugenics movement, which sought to sterilize those considered unfit to reproduce. One original motive for some progressives involved in the birth control movement was, in fact, to limit the offspring of unfit immigrants. So using this social Darwinist mindset, some progressives also defended the idea of taking away the right to vote for many people too poor and or uneducated to pay a poll tax or pass a strict literacy test before voting. This gave even more force behind the South's drive to keep blacks from voting. Once again, this was a dramatic divergence from the populist movement, which had tried to empower poor black and white farmers to work together against banks, big businesses, and landlords. And so, overall, one of the main divergences between the populist movement and the progressive movement was arguably the element of elitism in the progressive movement. The message that middle-class experts or government regulators knew best how things should be done. This perceived sense of elitism and moral sanctimony among the progressive reformers, that we are the most righteous, we know best, has ever since the progressive era generated a bit of a backlash against the idea of government intervention in the economy. Nowadays, this backlash takes the form of complaints about a nanny state getting in everyone's business, as is portrayed in this cartoon, where it shows someone being fed regulation, kind of like if this were your nanny, if the government's feeding you instructions for your own good, whether it's telling you what you can and can't eat, what you can and can't smoke or drink, or that you have to wear a seatbelt, or that you have to do this or that sort of thing, in the cultural sphere of how you live your life, And I would argue that if the idea of government regulations had maintained more of a populist flavor than a progressive one, there would arguably not be such a backlash against the modern government being perceived as this nanny state. For example, the populists would not have tried to regulate moral behaviors to such a degree, nor did the populists denigrate ordinary people as less enlightened than government regulators. No, instead, populists wanted government to regulate big business, not because government was more enlightened, but instead because government was seen as being more accountable to the demands of ordinary people. Big privately owned businesses seemed like a domineering force over which populists felt they had no control. For the populists, government regulation was seen as a tool for greater liberty by counterbalancing the domineering influence of big business. This vision of government regulation would have probably generated far less backlash and complaints about the nanny state, in my opinion. Settlement houses. Progressives who wanted to engage in social work established the settlement house movement. Settlement houses were the training ground for many leading progressive reformers. The concept of the settlement house, where educated middle-class people actually made their home in the slums to better help the poor, originated in England. They were single-sex residences, so segregated either for men or women, and Jane Addams founded the first well-known settlement house, Hull House, in Chicago in 1889. Settlement houses sought to improve the lives of the poor, usually immigrants, by meeting their needs for education, medical care, and recreation. They helped them assimilate with classes in English, American history, infant and child care, cooking, and housekeeping. They provided clinics, milk stations for pasteurized milk, public baths, daycare, kindergartens, playgrounds, gymnasiums, libraries, and clubs for various age groups. Because progressive reformers who worked in these settlement houses shared the same slum environment and worked with the poor, they campaigned for cleaner, better lit streets, better housing, and better schools, and improved public health. They wanted to improve these neighborhoods as well. Many idealistic young women went to live and work in a settlement house after graduation from university, and some remained to become powerful community leaders or went on to gain national prominence as leading progressive reformers. Many of the professionals and most of the volunteers in progressivism were women. This was the period in American history when women were arguably the most powerful in politics and social change. So why did they gain so much power? The ideological origins of women's role in reform lay in the early decades of the 19th century. In the gender roles of separate spheres, as it was called, women were believed to be more religious, more virtuous, more sexually pure, more kind-hearted, gentle, and nurturing than men. It was perceived as women's job to preserve all human virtues and inspire and influence men to be better. Women were initially supposed to stay in the home and create a refuge from the harsh, immoral world of business, a place where men could return to restore their piety and virtue. To protect humanity's virtues, women were not supposed to work outside the home. However, they soon demanded a public role in churches, organizing various programs and charities, and then in reform movements. Before the Civil War, women were active in the moral reform movement against prostitution, the temperance movement, and the abolition movement. By the 1860s, reform was women's mission in the public sphere. By 1900, middle-class women had expanded their role in reform and were ready to play key roles in progressivism. Their roles depended on whether they were single or married. Middle-class married women were not allowed to take jobs. It was heavily frowned upon, so their work had to be volunteer-based. Inspired by the social gospel movement, married women ran numerous church-based charities. Thousands joined reform movements. The most famous was the Women's Christian Temperance Union, which campaigned against alcohol. Another important one was the National Women's Trade Union League, in which wealthy women gave support to working-class women in strikes. The most important reform for many women was the campaign for women's suffrage, which had revived as the National American Women's Suffrage Association. Suffrage just means women's right to vote. Who knows why they called it that? I know it's always confusing, but doesn't mean women wanted women to suffer. Suffrage meant the right to vote. First, they sought the suffrage state by state, but after Carrie Chapman Catt became leader in 1915, the NAWSA campaigned for a federal amendment. Young feminists such as Alice Paul and Lucy Burns formed the more radical and confrontational National Women's Party, which also campaigned for a constitutional amendment. They used picketing the White House and other nonviolent resistance, and jailed members even went on hunger strike. Single women were able to obtain careers in progressivism. They were part of a younger generation of a more assertive and more feminist women, the new woman as it was called. They were the first generation of women to go to college, often at all women's colleges. Many focused on the social sciences, which was seen as more acceptable for women. The helping professions of education, medicine, public health, and social work were regarded as more suitable for women. College-educated women were also employed in city, state, and federal bureaucracies and commissions as inspectors, commissioners, and heads of department. Some examples of important female reformers in the progressive era were Jane Addams, founder of the Whole House Settlement House, Margaret Sanger, the founder of Planned Parenthood and promoter of the legalization of birth control, Susan B. Anthony, women's suffrage advocate, and finally, my favorite, Emma Goldman, advocate of free love, legalized birth control, and anarchist revolution. one of her catchphrases was, I will never support a revolution that I can't dance to. She was a kind of a crazy, free-spirited, um, one of the sayings, I forget the journalist who said this, when Emma Goldman was deported to Soviet Russia for her opposition to World War I. They said, journalism's going to be a lot less exciting without Red Emma Goldman around. Red meaning socialist or anarchist. But anyways, applying rule by experts to urban corruption. So as we learned in the last lesson, government was seen as very corrupt at every level in the late 1800s. Progressives wanted to eliminate this corruption and make government more scientific, rational, and efficient by putting more administrative tasks in the hands of appointed, supposedly impartial experts rather than elected party bosses. In the last lesson, we discussed the corruption of the urban political machines and the urban political party bosses. They were able to gain power and control by offering jobs and other services to immigrants in exchange for votes. Reformers blamed these political machines for many of the urban wrongs. Progressive reformers arose in cities to combat these corrupt political machines. Progressive reformers sought alternatives to the party political machine and wanted more efficient and businesslike city government. Municipal leagues of citizens formed to campaign for reform. City mayors and councils were in some cities replaced by appointed city managers and commissions. So, in total, progressivism was kind of a confusing mixed bag. There were some contradictions in the progressive movement that make it difficult to summarize the movement as a whole. Because on the one hand, progressives campaigned for greater citizen participation in government through reforms like the initiatives, referendums, recalls, direct election of senators, and so on. But then, on the other hand, progressives also wanted to limit popular control over some aspects of government, such as city management or monetary policy, in favor of having appointed experts decide on everything in those spheres. And similarly, when it comes to African American reformers, it's difficult to sum up these reform philosophies because they widely diverged here as well. There were really three different strands of African American reform, three different philosophies. One was a philosophy of vocational training and economic self-help first, before African Americans would focus on integration and political rights. And this was championed by Booker T. Washington. He helped establish the Tuskegee Institute to train African Americans in practical skills. He thought that this was the first necessary step, and that only with greater economic independence would African Americans have the clout to bargain for greater political rights in the future. And then, in sort of the exact opposite approach, you had people like W.E.B. Du Bois, who helped establish the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the NAACP, in order to overcome Jim Crow segregation and the lack of political rights for African Americans. So he said, no, we want to address the lack of political equality first. We can't get anywhere unless we address that first. And then you had people like Marcus Garvey, who said, forget America, let's go back to Africa. He thought that white Americans would never fully accept African Americans as their political or economic equals. So instead, he thought the only solution was to organize a movement of African Americans to go back to Africa and establish a separate self-governing black nation there. So that's progressivism. A very diverse bag of reforms and philosophies. And I look forward to your discussion of this reform movement on the discussion forums this week. So see you there.